Okay, well, good afternoon. What we're talking about today with the high tunnel is really pesticide usage in the high tunnel. Now, when it comes to high tunnels, the EPA really doesn't recognize that as a high tunnel. The EPA considers high tunnels to be greenhouses. And this is very important because when you look at pesticide labels, if there is a greenhouse prohibition for use, it works out to be a high tunnel prohibition for use. So high tunnels are considered greenhouses. So anytime something's prohibited in the greenhouse, it's also prohibited in the high tunnel. One other area that's a little bit different are shade houses. So anytime there's a porous material over a crop, it's not considered an enclosed space, and that would be considered a field situation. So but if you have a high tunnel with a porous or a non-porous material, that is a greenhouse. We have a large number of pesticides that are approved for use in the field that are prohibited for use in the greenhouse. And that's why it's very important to read under the directions for use section of the label to make sure that greenhouse use is not prohibited. If they do not mention greenhouses, if they're silent on greenhouses, then it is permissible in the greenhouse as long as the crop being sprayed is on the label. Something else to think about is, when we do spray in the greenhouse, we're now making applications in an enclosed area. And so there's a couple of things that come into play. One would be, of course, the restricted entry interval. When we apply within a greenhouse, we need to keep people out for the restricted entry on the interval. But there's a second factor that we often don't think about, and that's a ventilation requirement. So when you do spray any pesticide in the greenhouse, before people can re-enter the greenhouse, you need two things to happen. One is for the REI to expire, and the second is for a ventilation requirement to be met. And there's various ways the ventilation requirement can be met. You can have fans and do 10 air exchanges. That takes a lot of math. You have to know the flow rate of the fan and the volume of the greenhouse. You can use fans for 2 hours. That's another way to meet that requirement. You can use passive ventilation. You can open the end walls and the sides and just passively ventilate for 4 hours, and that will meet a ventilation requirement. And then there's other combinations of no ventilation plus either a fan or passive ventilation that can be used to meet that requirement, but it's going to be closer to 12 to 13 hours to get that done. If you can't do any of those ventilation requirements, you can wait 24 hours with a closed greenhouse, and then you can let people in. So with no ventilation, you have to wait at least 24 hours before people can go in. So that makes it very different from a pesticide application in the field where you don't have to worry about these ventilation requirements. Another factor we need to think about is when we spray pesticides in the greenhouse, we're in an enclosed area, we need to be very careful to look on that label to see if it requires a respirator or not. If a respirator is required, it is required. It's not an option. You have to wear it. You have to see the type of respirator that is required, whether it's a particulate respirator like an N95 or if it's an organic vapor respirator like the cartridges you see on the sides. Those are two different types for different types of products in the greenhouse. If a respirator is required, then you must have a medical exam. You need your doctor basically to tell you you're fit enough to wear a respirator while carrying a 50-pound backpack, wearing a suit when it's 95 degrees in the greenhouse. After you get a medical clearance from your doctor, every year you're going to have an annual fit test or fit test on your respirator, and that's to make sure that the model of respirator you're using, the size of that respirator, fits your face and doesn't leak. And so that's for tight-fitting respirators. If you cannot get a fit test, if you cannot get a respirator to fit your face, there are other alternatives where you can use a powered air purifying respirator. These look like helmets, and they actually have a pump that will pump air into that helmet, and it doesn't have to be tight fitting, and you don't need the medical clearance for that. So there are alternatives. Some of those tend to be much more expensive, though. So, something else to think about in the greenhouse is also chemigation. A lot of people want to apply some of their pesticides with their irrigation water. Just be careful. Many pesticides have very specific requirements in terms of what's permitted to be put out with chemigation. So see if there's a chemigation prohibition. See if the chemical you're allowed to hook it to a potable water system. If you can, there's always going to be an approved backflow preventer in that system to keep it from back siphoning into that potable water system. Some products you're allowed to do that, others you're not. If you're not allowed to hook it to a potable water system, one workaround would be having a separate fill tank. And the water that fills that fill tank has an air gap. So it would drop, and there's no way that the treated water could get back into the water system. So that is a workaround. The downside is you're probably going to need some sort of pump to move it through the drip irrigation system or the overhead irrigation system. But again, read the labels carefully and follow those label guidelines. Very important. Another area that we need to address also is, particularly when we're applying pesticides in a greenhouse and we have crops that need to be pollinated. If you're working with a product that is toxic to pollinators, you'll want to close up your bumblebees the night before, move them out of the greenhouse, put them in the shade. The next morning, make your application. Later that night, move the bumblebees back in and open them up. It's not perfect, but that mitigates the harm to your pollinators. The final thing is record keeping, and just like with the field applications, you need to keep track of all that information, what you're applying, both general and restricted use pesticides. I also find it's good to keep the other records on fit testing and other certifications you have in terms of private applicator or commercial applicator numbers, any gramoxone certification, any dicamba certification. Put all that together in your record keeping booklet, and that will make you good to go if you get inspected. Thank you.